see if I can make this work. There we go. Good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight. Emilie du Chatelet, Forgotten Thinkers. I was pondering whom to do in the Forgotten Thinkers series, and I thought Voltaire. I should do Voltaire. And I thought, no, people actually do know Voltaire. And I thought, Emilie du Chatelet, because the only reason people generally know of her is because she was Voltaire's lover. Which doesn't narrow the field very much. Voltaire had many lovers, so but she should be known for more than just being Voltaire's lover. So I wanted to start there. But sort of a preamble, maybe a pre-tirade perhaps. When I was doing research on Emilie, one of the things I discovered is that there is a movement to sort of find the lost female philosophers, which I'm entirely in favor of, by the way. But the argument goes, in several of them, the tenor of the argument was that the 20th century and 21st century university philosophy schools had repressed information and knowledge of women like Emilie du Chatelet, and that's why we don't know about them. This is not really the case nearly so much as the fact that women have been systematically denied education for all of recorded history. That's really the hurdle. You know, when you take half your population and say it's either illegal often, actually literally illegal for women to learn to read or write, and or you place other social restrictions to them having an opportunity to get any kind of education, then, yeah, you don't generate a lot of great female thinkers. It's not really the university's fault, per se. If they weren't letting women in now to be educated, it would be the university's fault. I just thought it was a very curious line of argument. It sort of overlooked the preceding 5,000 years of the failure to educate women and give them the opportunity to shine intellectually, which is why Emilie is such a great role model, and that's why I thought it was good to talk about her. The other background that we need is what used to be called the invisible college. It's not something we have as much anymore. But starting in the late 17th century, mid-17th century, but going right on through till the late, early 20th century maybe, but at least late 19th century, there was no real systematic method for higher education. I mean, there were a few universities around. Most of them were religiously oriented. You had a few tech schools, engineering schools were starting up, but this was also new. And so if you were, say, doing geology research, geological research, which is sort of getting off the ground in the mid-1700s, you would just write letters to people. And you would say, hi, I'm in the Netherlands and I've dug up some things that look like this, and I heard that you had written an article on this. Do you have anything to say? And then these letters would circulate. One of the things that the Royal Academy of Sciences in England had was a translation service and a mail clearinghouse. So people could write to them in, say, Dutch, and then they would translate it into maybe English and Italian, and they would forward it on to people who they thought might be interested in that subject. And so this network of generally self-educated, often but not invariably noble women coming, who were pursuing their own interests. And so they called this, again, the invisible college, because there was no particular organized society. The societies were just getting started. The universities are becoming much more like what we think of as universities. But really, there was no such thing as a research university, where you would do scientific experiments. That didn't really exist. The notion of being a professional philosopher really didn't exist. So these sorts of things that we take for granted didn't exist then. But to understand someone like Emilie du Chatelet, you need to understand that the people she was thinking about, the people she wanted to communicate with and impress, was this broad European-wide spread of individuals who were not necessarily associated with institutions, some of them were, but were simply famous for their publications and the research, often in the form of letters, as much as anything else. Sometimes books, often self-published books. So this is it's a very different world. And what she wanted to be, as we'll see, was called a philosophe. Not a philosopher per se, but a philosophe. So that's just, keep the invisible college in mind, because this is going to come back several times. So as you can see, she was born in 1706. Fortunately for me, we know nothing about her childhood, which is great, because that means I don't have to learn anything about it. She was born to a very well-connected noble family, but they were the aristocracy that had been appointed, they had gained their aristocratic titles through service to the king. And this is one sort of aristocracy. The other kind of aristocracy was the landed gentry that had had their nobility come down from, in theory, time immemorial, but, going back 100, 200, 300, 400 years, associated with, specific regions and specific land. And the nobility of the service, nobility of the robe, the people who gained access to the king and queen, which is all about court access, through service, and then were ennobled, were slightly looked down on, but on the other hand, they had access to the king and queen directly, which means, of course, access is power, so they were also very powerful. For her family was the aristocracy through service to the king. Her parents and grandparents had been serving the French royal family, Versailles and the whole thing. Louis XV is who will become most important, but they'd also, earlier relatives had been associated with the Sun King, Louis XIV. And so they had a very long tradition of this. They were extraordinarily well placed, direct access to the king and queen, high-ranking courtiers, lots of state jobs, very solid income, of course, lots of money associated with this. And so she was raised as one of the most privileged, most elite people in France. So all of those things, wonderful things you see about Versailles and the court and the dramas where everybody dresses up and looks great, this is her people. This is where she's from. She marries. Again, we know nothing about her education. She probably wasn't systematically educated. At this time, women tended not to be. Her education would have consisted of things like deportment, dancing, basic literacy, lots of religious education, which will be important. She would probably go to Mass every single day of her life when she was a child. So His Most Catholic Majesty, right? So Catholicism is a very big issue. But beyond that, why? Why bother? Why, they need to read, they need to write, but they're women. They can't do anything. And so after, it became very spotty. But we don't even know, beyond the general outlines of how aristocratic female children were educated, anything. We just basically don't know anything about her upbringing. But she marries, and she marries the Marquis du Chatelet, hence her name, Marquise du Chatelet. He was the nobility of the land. He was the landed gentry, and very, very highly placed landed gentry. General in the king's armies, he moved up through the ranks very nicely through his connections and service and the many wars that France was always fighting at this time. And she lots of inherited land associated with that. So when she gets married, she follows the pattern of her class, which is her husband goes away, and she moves to Paris and has lots of lovers, and spends all of her time building social connections and climbing, increasing her status at the court, promoting her lovers. This is one of the things that women spend a lot of time doing, because they couldn't have careers. They would spend an immense amount of energy promoting the careers of their lovers, their friends, their children, their husbands. That was what you did. And so it's endless social circles. She's changing her clothes, 6, 7, 8 times a day sometimes for different events, getting up early, staying up late. I mean, it was really this sort of career, this life. And I go into this in a little bit of detail, because she was she wasn't the king or the queen, but she was almost at the pinnacle of French society when French society was at one of its great cultural peaks. You have Louis XV, you have Voltaire, you have all the salons in Paris, all the famous things we think of. And when she's about 23 or 24, right in there, she thinks, I want to get an education. I want to become educated. And she wasn't really at this point. I mean, again, she's literate, she can write letters, and she can read, but she thought, I really do want to get an education. And she hires tutors, and specifically math tutors. And it turns out that she's really, really good at math. She goes through a couple of tutors. She's lovers with one probably. You know, all the ins and outs and things are going on. But she takes it increasingly seriously. And there was a bit of a vogue at time for noble women to, you know, become lettered. But she really went for it. One of her tutors said at first, oh yeah, I've done the Duchess of this and the Countess of that, and here I go, I've got this. In his letters, he goes, oh, I've got this other noblewoman, but she's going to pay. And so he starts working with her, and like his letters a while later are like, ooh, wait a second. This is a whole different kettle of fish. She is a very bright woman, and very impressively bright woman. Around this time, she also meets Voltaire, and Voltaire is probably the most famous person in France after the king, famous and notorious. He had written his famous poem in French history, which sort of established his fame, but he was constantly in trouble because A, he wasn't an aristocrat, which meant he was just a servant, and it's hard for us to come to grips with what a barrier there was at this time. The famous story from Voltaire's life is he was at a party, and a duke, I can't remember the duke's name, forget him anyway, he made a quip, and Voltaire fired right back because he's Voltaire. And sort of everyone laughed at the duke. And so when Voltaire went outside, the duke's henchmen beat him with clubs. This was not like a casual roughing up. They beat him with clubs. The result of which, Voltaire was taken to court because he had insulted a duke. And all of the aristocracy, who had been treating him so well and so wonderfully and saying how great he was and what a genius and what a brilliant, said, well, he's a duke. You can't do that. You're nobody. And it was very educational for him. So Emilie is the aristocracy. But she starts moving in the circles with Voltaire. They start to correspond. Voltaire starts becoming very taken with her. And at about the age of 25, at 25, she decides, that's it. I want to move to the country with Voltaire. I'm going to study, and I'm going to become educated. And I'm leaving the life of Paris. I'm going to give it up. And everybody thought this was crazy. The saying at the time was, ennui is the disease, and Paris is the cure. You had literally thousands, if not tens of thousands, wealthy, well-positioned, individuals all throughout France trying desperately to gain access to Versailles, the king and the queen, the courts, and everything that she had. And she said, I'm giving it up because I want to learn. I want to study. I want to gain knowledge. I want to improve myself. I think I'm wasting my life doing this. My days pass pleasantly, but I'm not being the full me that I can be. That is an extraordinary turning point for a young woman in 1731 or so. No, she wouldn't be 25 and 31. When would she be 25? Yeah, 1731. To simply abandon that. And like I said, her friends at the time, we have the letters, said, oh, she won't last 6 months. And so Voltaire was holed up because he was threatened with arrest, as he usually was. And he had been arrested repeatedly, by the way, so it wasn't an idle threat. He would have been arrested. So he's hiding out at the country estate of the Marquis du Chatelet, the Chatelet, sort of home estate in Cirey. Cirey is the name of it. And Emilie says, I'm going to move out there and move in with him. Well, and it was in the middle of nowhere, 6 or 7 or 8 days from Paris, which meant on Mars. No one had actually occupied the house for over a decade because it wasn't in Paris, so why would you be there? Her husband only went there once a year when he had to settle accounts and take care of things. And so she says, I'm going to move there with Voltaire, and writes her husband and says, I'm going to move in with Voltaire at our estate and fix it up. And he's like, great. Because the house is falling apart, and then you can watch over the business, and because I'm off fighting wars all the time. So this is perfect. This is working out wonderful for everybody. And Voltaire, spectacularly rich, by the way, through various sorts of money manipulation schemes, invested his own money into rebuilding the chateau there at Cirey. And so they just start this adventure going. But what's important is at 25, think about this. What were you thinking when you were 25, or if you are 25? To give up, the whole life that you've been trained and pointed towards, and to say, no, I want an education. I want to learn. I want to make something of myself and my mind, quite consciously. And she struggled with herself. Because this is moving to when their early visitors said they were visiting a Carthusian monastery. They would stop for a couple of days and then leave, and they would just, it's impossible. They're not going to make it. It's nowhere. There's nothing. There's just the chateau. But they did make it. They stayed for pretty much 5 years consecutively, and then on and off for the rest of their lives, Voltaire and, rest of Emilie's life. She died earlier than Voltaire. They were pretty much there. And so she starts to study with Voltaire, by the way, a good person to study with, but also on her own. She hired tutors, lots of math tutors, and it turns out Voltaire's mind did not turn towards mathematics, and hers did. So they really pretty quickly started going their own separate ways, although they did work together on a couple of projects. An early one, and this will give you an idea of the tenor of her mind, was experiments with fire. And so the Academy of Sciences in Paris, in France, but it's really the King's Royal Academy, would put out prizes for various problems, and if you could solve them, you would win money, or they'd publish your results, and it was sort of to bring the invisible college together. And so Voltaire and Emilie decided to enter it, because they wanted, the question is, what is fire, essentially? Because they didn't know, is it a substance, is it a thing, or is it a condition? It's, this is before people knew these sorts of questions. And so they went out and ran lots of experiments, not one or two, but they had a foundry there, and so they had the people, I think the workers must have thought they were nuts, right? But they'd go out and they would have things heated up, and they'd weigh them when they're hot, and they'd let them cool down, and they'd weigh them when they're cold, and this goes on for months, and they did lots of work together, and it turns out that Voltaire and Emilie disagreed. And so they each submitted an answer. Right now, and now think about this. Now I think this is 27 years old, right in there. She's been working with Voltaire, who's both older and world famous. He is one of the most famous people, certainly in France and all across Europe. And when they do the experiments and study the results, she just says, "You're wrong. You're wrong. You're not getting this right at all." And so they put separate papers in. And through various manipulations, but she, of course, submitted hers anonymously because she was a woman. But curiously, of course, and this is important to note, everybody knew who had submitted it, who mattered. Because, it's going to come on her paper in her handwriting to the courtiers and the people that her parents and friends and relatives had appointed to the positions that they have, probably from her servant or with her letterhead from the, Chatelet estate, right? So the anonymity was only for the public. Anybody who knew the inside was, of course, no, this is Emilie. This is who's doing this. And so the judges, they didn't win, neither of them won, but they decided to publish them, as they would do if they thought the essays were very good, basically. They thought the work was interesting and that other people should read them. They decided to publish it. This is her first big breakthrough. But this is significant because when you're published by the Academy of Sciences, this means congratulations, you're a philosophe. You've arrived, because that's now going to be distributed. It's got the King's Royal imprimatur on there, and so this is like her moment of arrival. But again, significantly, she leaves Paris to go live with Voltaire on the estates out in the countryside, and in very short order, she says, Voltaire, you're wrong. Love you. Get along. You're wrong. I'm right. I'm writing my own essay. So this project of self-liberation was very rapid and very powerful with her. And so this acceptance and printing of her submission, and she was right, by the way, and Voltaire was wrong. I should say this. I should mention that she was correct. Fire is not a substance. It's not something that hot things are taking in, and then when they cool off, it leaves. It is a condition, a state of matter, right? the exciting of the atoms. She didn't know it was the exciting of the atoms yet, but she was very much further along that line. And so this was just heartening for her. But because it is the 18th century again, the philosophe meant someone who might do physics experiments in the morning, write odes in the afternoon, and write an opera in the evening, right? I mean, it was a wide-ranging. And so one of the things she did, and it was sort of a bestseller in her lifetime, was she did Discourse on Happiness, which I give a big print here because I think it's important to understand who she was and where she was coming from. So it's on the front page. In order to be happy, one must have freed oneself of prejudice. One must be virtuous, healthy, have taste in passions, and be susceptible to illusions. So let's start with those. This is an interesting list. By the way, this was one of the readings for one of the major exams in France just a few years back. So if you look this up under its French title, you'll find all the notes that people were sharing to try and pass the back, because this was on there. In order to be happy, one must have freed oneself of prejudices. Now, one of the prejudices she had to free herself from was that Voltaire was a commoner. This is a big leap, right? Everyone was fine with her having Voltaire as her lover. That's fine. That doesn't, who cares? But to make a serious life investment with a commoner, this is ridiculous. Remember, this is roughly the same time that Mozart is being paid as if I think he's a second cook. That was the status of Mozart on the wages when he was hired. And he was treated remarkably poorly because he was not a member of the nobility. They just treated him very poorly. It's not until 50 years after this when you get someone like Beethoven who just won't take it anymore, who says, I'm Beethoven, you can go away. He says there's 1,000 princes, there's only one Beethoven. This was his attitude. But one of the prejudices she had to overcome to pursue her happiness was that Voltaire was a commoner, and she did. This was extraordinary. She also had to come over a prejudice that noble women, real women, attractive women, wealthy women, don't spend their time trying to be wise. Don't try to educate themselves. Why would you do this? I mean, it's fine to dabble around with this or that, but to sit, she literally was working hours and hours and hours a day, exhausting herself in studies. So prejudices. You have to overcome your prejudices. One must be virtuous. By virtuous, she meant doing what you think is right. You will feel better. So when she makes the decision, in her letters, one of the things she reflects, she finally makes the decision, no, I do want to go to live in the country with Voltaire, and I do want to educate myself. And she writes about how powerful this made her feel, how great this made her feel. That being able to do what you feel is right inside yourself really gave her a sense of worth and power and capacity, which she then used effectively. Health, be healthy, not like I was last time. Have tastes, and she thought she's sort of in the Oscar Wilde camp, that much of life is a discernment of taste and preferences. And if you don't know what your preferences are, then how are you supposed to know what you like? And then how are you supposed to know how to enjoy your life if you don't know what your tastes are? So she thought having taste, knowing what they were, spending time on them was a significant portion of being happy. The example I always like is if people say something like, oh, I don't like opera. I say, well, that's fine. How many operas have you been to? And they're like, none. See, that's not knowing tastes, right? If you haven't tried or experimented, how do you know, right? That was sort of what she's driving at there. Passions, the same thing. But she said passions are big tastes. Her passion for Voltaire, her passion for knowledge and for mathematics. She says those are great, but she says the problem with them is you can't choose them. They choose you. You can't make yourself be passionate, essentially. But passions will seize you, and it's great if you can have them. So make your life available for passions so that when it comes along, you'll have that great, that drive, that force, that life power well up in you. And the curious one, and be susceptible to illusions. Now, for someone who's a mathematician and a proponent of reason of the first order, what she means here is things like if you go to the theater and you tell yourself, well, it's all fake, you've missed the point. If you look at a handsome courtier who's trying to court you, and you go, well, I think perhaps he's just flattering me because he wants to seduce me, you're missing the point. Right? This sort of, she said, reason is good, but it's almost this notion of cynicism, right? That defends us from being open to impressions and for allowing things to really affect us. And we go, oh, well, they're just in it for the money, they're just in it for this, it's all a big sham. And then pretty soon, everything is a big sham, and then life loses all of its mystery and magic and power, and she thought that was deadening. That when you think life has no great mysteries and powers and opportunities and passions, well, then you're really missing out. And those are her main core here, but then she goes on. And one must begin by saying to oneself and by convincing oneself that we have nothing to do in this world but to obtain ourselves some agreeable sensations and feelings. That's what we're here for. We're not here for any other agreeable sensations and feelings. Pursue that, enjoy what you do and you'll enjoy yourself, right? I mean, kind of don't do things you don't enjoy and you'll avoid not enjoying yourself. Sort of that. But notice for a woman who probably had been to Mass every single day of her life for decades, to just stand up and say, look, no, this is silly. And we'll see where that goes. The moralists who say to me, curb your passion and master your desire if you want to be happy, do not know the route to happiness. One is only happy because of satisfied tastes and passions. It is passions that one should ask of God, if one dared to ask him anything, and Lenotre was quite right to ask the Pope for temptations rather than indulgences. You want temptations, you want passions, you want that desire, you want that sense of striving and possibility and opportunity. So was it, like I said, this was a bestseller for her. I mean, within the comparative world of her time. This was reprinted. People really loved it. I mean, it goes on. It's very short. I recommend reading the whole thing. It's maybe 15, 20 pages. But it really is a fascinating consideration of these issues. And then finally, she finished up, the first thing to do is to be resolute about what one wants to be and about what one wants to do. This is lacking in almost all men. It is, however, without it, it is necessary, however. Without it, one swims forever in a sea of uncertainty. One destroys in the morning what one has made in the evening. Happiness takes courage. You have to be resolute about who you want to be and what you want to do. And if you aren't resolute, you're probably not going to make it. And so this notion is a very interesting mix of sort of personal drive, personal integrity, but in the pursuit of your interests, your joys, your pleasures, and making yourself big. And like I said, it resonated with the times. People found this fascinating, particularly coming from a woman who had, you can see where this comes from. She has personally lived this out. I changed what I was doing because I believed I could live a better, fuller, more pleasant life. And she did. All the evidence is that she did. So this was her first big sort of bestseller after the fire essay. And then I want to go to another one that she worked on this for years. It turns out to be, it's on the next page, on the back page. She worked on it. It was about 700 pages when she finally wrapped it up. And it's basically called Examines the Bible. And I think it was just purgative for her. She just needed to get it out of her system. Because, again, it's hard for us to imagine how inculcated she would have been in Catholicism. Even if you didn't believe it, you're still just inundated with it in 18th century France. And so she did this long project. She did some of it with Voltaire, but modern scholarship says, and people used to say, oh, well, this is all just Voltaire. And it turned out, no, this is mostly 90% Emilie. This is her work. She did this. This isn't her just sort of cadging notes from Voltaire. But what she does, and it's almost extraordinary to think about, is she goes line by line through the Bible and disagrees with every single line. I mean, this is the new critical edition of this, which just came out, by the way, in 2012, is 1,000 pages long, because it has commentary to help out with, certain references that we've lost. It's 1,000 pages long, and in French. Hasn't been translated into English yet, unfortunately. I don't know if it will be, but I hope it is. I want to make a page-a-day calendar, all right, where you just, for 365 days of Emilie du Chatelet says this about the Bible. But here's just a few, random selections in no particular order. And it is, by the way, it is humor. It is, I think it is hilarious, actually. In Genesis 1:4, God divides the light from the shadows, as if shadows were something that could be separated from the lights. It is very amusing to see 3 days and 3 nights marked by the morning and the evening before the sun was created. For it was only created on the 4th day. I mean, so it is 1,000 pages of that right there. And it just goes on and on. In the end, God gained nothing by this detour, the 40 years of the desert, Moses leading the people through the desert. For one will see that the Israelites never stopped complaining in the desert and never stopped regretting that they had left Egypt. Right? So because the other thing she does is she uses the classics. You get the whole Bible, and then you get a whole bunch of apologetics from biblical scholars also. And she attacks both of them. And so somebody says, well, why would you spend 40 years wandering the desert? Well, this guy over here, some biblical scholar of fame and note, says, oh, it's to train the Israelites to appreciate God and to forget about Egypt. And she says, no, they never did. It didn't work. Then we move to the New Testament. We get moments like this. It is curious that Jesus died in public and in full view, but was resurrected in secret with no witnesses. which is just a very pithy way to... and she, by the way, she has if you can read her in the French, I recommend it. She has a very exacting, her mind works just like very pithy, very exacting mind. It's a wonderful mind to encounter. It is said in Matthew 1:18 that Mary found herself pregnant before Joseph and she had lived together, which with several other places in the gospel that tell of the brothers of Jesus Christ and that Jesus was called the firstborn of Mary, she had other children by Saint Joseph. Now remember, Saint Joseph in Catholicism, right? And so she just goes here and she just builds this, look, it is curious that she had just said that Mary found herself pregnant before Joseph had lived together, right? Curiosity number one. And then what about all these other brothers? Where did they go? What happened to them? And so, like I said, it is, in her handwriting, it's 700 pages. Of course, you could not publish this in her lifetime. And this is why I want to go back to the College of Letters again, because we would think, oh, that means it must have been secret. No. You circulate it in manuscript form to your friends. And at least 5 different versions of this have survived. And it influenced people so much that a couple of years after her death, a famous Catholic scholar felt that he needed to argue against it. And so so there actually are polemicists who spend time in their arguments saying, oh, well, here's what Emilie du Chatelet gets wrong in her examinations of the Bible. Right? So even though it wasn't published, and never, of course, was widely circulated, because you immediately get arrested and go to jail, like Voltaire, people did know. It did circulate. These ideas were moving around. They're in her letters. People are getting excerpts from it. People who visit, they're reading to them at night from these. What are you working on? Oh, I'm working on this little thing on the Bible. Would you like to hear the first 500 pages? And so this is being read out. And again, so this is just this extraordinarily amazing break. I mean, for the time, this would be sort of, good stuff for the modern atheist movement, so very powerful. So go back, 200, 300 years, and make yourself a woman with no particular educational background, and now just take on the entire theocratic intellectual establishment. This is what she did. I mean, it wasn't a small entity, it was huge. I'm going to argue with all of the supposed experts on the Bible who are backed by the church and backed by the state. They have the fame, they have the access, they have the publications, they have their own newspapers, but here I go, 700 pages of hitting them with a hammer. It's a really impressive feat of both intellectual vigor and incredible insight, because it's just pithy. It is hilarious. section after section. Some of it has been translated into English. I can't find any readily available versions of it. So for about $230, you can get the New French Critical Edition. I think I'm going to wait for the paperback myself. So while she's working on this, and she tended to work on things simultaneously, she did the work that would bring her the greatest fame, both in her lifetime and well, I guess 2 works. The first one she did essentially called The Foundations of Physics. And this, again, it's hard for us to understand, but there was no division between science and philosophy at this time. It's just developing. And all kinds of questions. What is fire? Why do the planets attract each other? What keeps them in orbit? Do heavier things fall faster than lighter things? How does gravity work? Just the entire gamut of science was open, but it was confused and mixed in with metaphysics. What's the first cause? Where did the universe come from? Is the universe necessary? All of these questions. And she wrote she studied Newton, by the way, this entire time. She was which we'll see in a second. She was a big student of Newton, and she agreed with him a lot of things, but she disagreed with him on a lot of things, like everything else, like Voltaire, like the church, mostly disagreement with the church. And so she studied with a student of Leibniz, and she had been reading lots of Leibniz. She'd been reading a lot of Newton. The French sort of champion intellectual at the time was Descartes. So these were the Cartesian philosophers, and so the Cartesians and the Newtonians are at loggerheads, arguing back and forth across the channels. The letters were flying, the arguments are going madly back and forth. And so she steps in the middle of this and writes essentially a textbook. In theory it was for her son, in practice it was for everybody, that says, here is how essentially the universe works. From first causes through light and gravity and necessary logical structures, everything. I mean, it's like a huge textbook, the foundation of physics. I mean, that's what it is. It's just this massive thing. But she starts with, I can only touch on it because it's big and it's powerful, but she starts with the notion of the universe. Metaphysical sense. What's necessary? She starts with some logical propositions, which is a very logical work. And she says, well, the universe basically needs a creator. It needs a first cause. And we'll call that God. So she wasn't a true atheist. And what happens is that God creates the universe, but that's it. Essentially, it's the watchmaker, clockmaker God, the deist. She's a classic deist. He wound the universe up, and now that's it. No more intervention, no miracles. Miracles cannot happen, because if miracles happen, then there are no physical laws. Because we know there are physical laws, and the world is rational and orderly, then that means God has to keep his hands off. And so she, as one commentator said, she had the remarkable feat of defining God with no reference to the church, the state, the Bible, miracles. It's just this incredibly rational. And if you just took out God and put in the Big Bang or the singularity, fine. It would work equally well. We don't know what happened before then, and so it's just a big cipher. It really is so logical and clear. But in the course of this, she does a couple of things. She cites correctly with Newton on the notion that planets attract each other, that gravity is an attractive force. As opposed to the Cartesians who had this notion of turbulence and just a different theory for trying to explain various options. She argued with Leibniz about some things. She argued with Newton about some things. She disagreed with one of Newton or Leibniz's students, Wolff, about several issues in the foundations of physics, and created systematic answers for all kinds of events. And she was correct, by the way, on optics and light. She had some very important insights into light and how light works. Again, one of the big questions of the time. She expands her thesis of fire and comes pretty close to black body radiation, which is a pretty major insight considering what she had to work with. It really is just this, it's hard to summarize or even pick anything out of it in particular, because it is just a about 200-page systematic review and argument for how all of physics and the universe is organized. This was so well received, published in France originally, so one, very, very good news. Two, immediately upon it being translated into Italian, it was translated into several languages. She was put on she got a seat, an honorary seat on the Academy of Sciences in Italy, in Rome. I mean, they said, wow, she's great. I think she was the first woman to ever receive that honor. So, I mean, she has really arrived. When it was translated into German, the comment was, oh, this is great. We have Emilie du Chatelet explaining to us what Leibniz meant. Because it was so much clearer in her, even when she disagreed with him, which she did. She wasn't a pure Leibnizian by any extreme. But her explanation and her use of his logical tools was so clear, so concise, and so well presented that people were like, wow, this is great. This is so, this helps us understand what Leibniz was talking about. Thank you very much. And so the awards and sort of recognition really started to flow to her now. People are writing to her. She's corresponding with all the leading thinkers, not all of them, but many of the leading thinkers in Europe. And she's working at a furious pace, an unbelievable pace, for someone who was doing lots of other things, as I'll mention now. So she's moving. She's about 40 now. She does all this, by the way. So someone who really starts to be educated at 25, by the time she is 40, has become a recognized thinker across Europe. That's pretty good, I would say. That is no small feat, considering the incredible amount of prejudice she had to overcome, both externally, the society's prejudice against women, and thinking, oh, isn't she such a cute, noble woman dabbling in mathematics? But I think even greater was the internal prejudice. Right? She says to free yourself from prejudice, I can do this. I do have the capacity, and I want to. That double overcoming, I think that's pretty impressive for 15 years. Pretty fast. Oh, and I should mention, by the way, when she did bring out the foundations of physics, it came out in 2 editions, but the publication history doesn't really matter. The head of the Academy of Sciences in France thought, oh, I have to sort of ride to the defense of the Cartesians here, because she's sort of taking the Newton line quite often. But he wasn't sure how to do it. Do I take her seriously as a philosopher, a philosophe, and sort of argue with her that way, but that gives her credibility? Or do I say, well, this is just a work from a woman who doesn't know any better, and try to dismiss her? And the gentleman, unfortunately for him, chose to sort of say, well, these are complicated issues, and, it's not clear she really understands this, and she doesn't really understand. And he wrote this kind of condescending assault on her. But in a sort of, he wanted to be a gentleman about it, and so it has this mix of condescension and gentlemanliness. And her riposte was so crushing that it became sort of a cause célèbre. That because these are all public documents, and so when she wrote back to him, she just destroyed him, and he was just routed from the field. And all of the guy's friends said, "Don't say anything more about it. You've lost. The best thing to do is retire from the field. You're done. You just got crushed. Just leave it alone. It's all over for you." So I mean, she is getting this. She is noted. She is known. She is famous. She's a philosopher. She's a thinker. And for a while she'd been having this idea, and she started working on a translation of the Principia Mathematica of Newton, which is one of the most important works in the history of science. And her translation, which is published posthumously, by the way, she dies very shortly here, is to this day essentially the standard French work on Newton. I mean, it was an extraordinary achievement. But to give you an idea of what she had to do, I gave you this passage from Newton. This is translated into English, by the way. It is less clear than this in the original Latin. So this is what she had to try and translate. Every body that moves in any curved line described in a plane and by a radius drawn to a point either immovable or moving forward within a uniform rectilinear motion describes about that point areas proportional to the times is urged by centripetal force directed to that point. Case 1. For every body that moves in a curved line is, by law 1, turned aside from the rectilinear course by the action of some force that impels it, and that force by which the body is turned off from its rectilinear course and is made to describe in equal times the equal right triangle SAB, SBC, SED, and such, about the immovable point S by proposition XL Book 1, elements and law 2, acts in the place B according to the direction of the lineal parallel C, that is in the direction of the line BS in the place of C according to the direction of the line in parallel AD, that is in the direction of line CS and such, and therefore acts always in the directions of line tending to an immovable point S, QED. This is several hundred pages long. And this is not the most imponderable, just like this, for ever. So first she had to translate it, but then she had to give a commentary so that people could understand what the hell Newton was talking about. And it's important to note that if you've taken calculus and these sorts of, all of the symbols and the mathematical representation hadn't been developed yet. Newton didn't develop this. And so he's not using, that had to be created. And it was created by people like Emilie, who went through and said, this is what he means. Now how can I transcribe that so other people understand this? This is an extraordinary intellectual achievement to understand what Newton is talking about, which there wasn't a lot of people in Europe at this point who did. She was a handful of people who really could get her mind around it. Two, to then have the capacity to translate it at all, and then to be able to write, again, her concise mind, the beauty of her insight and the ability to make it clear on the page, makes it, again, sort of essentially the standard work to this day in French. I mean, 300 years later, it's her work that is often taught. It's extraordinary. Like I said, really a powerful achievement in its own right. And people often say, oh, this is a translation. No, this is not a translation. I mean, it is a translation, but it's a translation with a heck of a lot of intellectual labor there, and then the commentary to make it accessible to other people. I mean, it really is one of the great achievements. Even greater was the fact that she finished this working furiously because she had become pregnant by a lover after Voltaire. And if you're pregnant in that time, when you're in your 40s, this is considered dangerous. And so she had this horrible fear that she was going to die in childbirth and her translation wouldn't be finished. And then that would be all. That's what she would be left with, right? Her unfinished works, and she wouldn't really have made a name for herself. And so she's, literally working like 12 and 14 hours a day. I don't know how it would even be possible to do that. But she did, while pregnant, and she just canceled all her events, and she wasn't seeing people, and she was just working and working and working, and she pretty much finished it up, gave birth to her daughter, and died. 42. And that she turns out to be correct. Her fears were borne out, and they don't know why. This wasn't a clear cause. I mean, lots of women died of childbirth at this time, of course, but she may have just exhausted herself. She may have just killed herself with work. That was the kind of drive that she had. But her works lived on. Her Principia translation worked on. The influence of her letters, which we don't have time to talk about, but in a world of letters, in the world of the invisible college, your ideas were shared through letters, and she was an expert at that. Her influence on Voltaire, people always talk about Voltaire's influence on her. She influenced Voltaire. A number of his important works are heavily influenced by both her presence in his life, the model that she set, and her ideas. I mean, so the influence goes the other way as well. But finally, one of the things that she talked about in her essay on happiness was that the realm of the intellect was the one place that women had the opportunity to achieve glory. And she thought the pursuit of glory was one of those things that really could make you happy. And she said, I know it's an illusion, but this is one of those illusions that she liked. And she said, I do want my works to live on after I die. I do want to make a name for myself. I do want glory. I can't do it in the military. I can't do it in politics. I can't do it in finance. But I can do it in the realm of the intellect. And all of the evidence is that she did, which is extraordinary. Like I said, when you consider when she's 23 or 24, essentially no particular education. By the time she's 40, she's one of the most noted philosophers in Europe. And basically did this herself. I mean, she really did do it. And the reason I want to end on the concept of glory is to go back where I started. Remember I mentioned that there's these essays about, people haven't told us about Emilie du Chatelet, and there's these other, probably great female thinkers out there who haven't been discovered. And this is probably true. And one, if anybody's, cares, the place you're likely to find them in Europe are the abbesses and prioresses of the nunneries and the convents, because these were often noble women, had the most opportunity to have an education, and had the time and the ability to write their ideas down. So brush up your medieval Latin and head to Europe, because I bet you they're out there. But more significantly, and I think what Emilie du Chatelet would say, is you don't want to find great female philosophers. Nothing wrong with that. You want to be a great female philosopher. That is the goal. That is the glory. The glory is in remaking yourself into something extraordinary and powerful and wonderful that will make you happy and hopefully make you famous. So, Emilie du Chatelet.